Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to review this baby sword right here. It is an arming dagger from Darksword Armory, and it was sent to me at my request from Darksword. A few folks have asked me to review a dagger from Darksword Armory. I requested one, and they sent this, the arming dagger, which retails in this configuration for $265, a little less if you want the non-sharpened version. But this one was sharpened, so keep that price in mind, and that it's a review sample as you hear my ramblings throughout this video. The other bit that maybe you should know up front is that I'm not going to do any historical stuff with it. I don't know how analogous this is to historical pieces. It looks the part a little bit, but I don't really have any basis to say that. The other bit is I'm not going to do any HEMA because I don't know any. So if you're hoping to see it from that lens, unfortunately you're going to have to look elsewhere. But what the video will include is some close-ups of all the bits and bobs and fits and features, so you can get some idea of the close-ups, what it contains, how well it's built, and if it's worth your money or not, hopefully. And I'm going to guess that this Darksword Armory dagger is similar to some of the other offerings that they have, so assumably some of the build quality that you see on this is going to be representative across the line of daggers that they have, at least to some degree. The other bit that you should note is I'm not going to break it, or rather I haven't broken it. Throw in the commentary down below if you would find it valuable to see me push it to failure, but I would say in this video you're going to see me abuse it. I've done things with this dagger that it's not really meant to do, and it survived to tell the tale, which is a testament to build quality in itself. Spoiler alert, but in a nutshell, I'm not going to be breaking it, but I will push it, I will use it, and you will see me do that. And then at the end, I will reflect on it and tell you whether I think it's worth it or not. So, with no further ado, on with the reviewing. So I'm going to start with the pommel, the end bit right here, and what I can see first is that it has a peen. It's very much built like a baby sword, and you can see there's a mechanical connection, a peen right here. It's pretty much constructed just like a Darksword Armory sword is, and the peen is the first indication of that. There are some hammer marks on here, or rather tool markings, I should say. There's a slight ledge, but nothing that catches my hands, and overall I would say that this is acceptable for the price point and what you're expecting to get here on a dagger. The other bit I want to note is that the profile of this particular pommel right here doesn't narrow. It's pretty much parallel. It's canted off to the side a little bit because this one has been thrown at a tree several times, but overall it's pretty much even in profile, and I like to see things swell or change in this dimension, but this one doesn't. Again, I'm not expecting it. It'd just be nice to have. The other bits I want to note is that aesthetically this looks small to me. At the same time, when I put it in my hand, I'm very glad that it is, because this ergonomically feels great. If I hold the pommel thusly, my finger kind of rests right in the face area. Nothing bites in, nothing chews up my hand. It actually kind of adds to the experience. I can hold it further down, and if I hold it in like a hammer grip, then the meat of my hand touches this kind of facet, this area of the pommel, and it's rounded in such a way that it doesn't chew into my hand, and it's not so bulbous that it tries to break my grip. Overall, this size, dimension, and execution is pretty ergonomic, and one of the better feeling wheel pommels that I've had in my hand. So I'm actually glad that it is the way that it is, if it had to be a wheel pommel. The way the pommel transitions to the grip is also pretty clean. There's no schmutz, gunk, or any of that kind of stuff. Sometimes the material, or rather the lacquer, whatever they put over the grip, sometimes in some manufacturers you'll see that there's residue or something like that, or you can make out the wooden panels or scales or something like that where the tang is running through. I don't see any of that here. It's overall a pleasant looking transition. There is a little bit of rust on the surface, so whatever material they're using is some sort of carbon steel, because it rusts. Not a lot. I've neglected this, but there is some rust forming. I found it overall pretty easy to clean. In the facets as well, or these faces on the wheel pommel, the recessed areas, there's also some tool marking, and mine came with some residue buffing compound that was stuck in some of the cracks. So do note that it's not perfect here, but a lot of people stick coins or some other bedazzlement in the faces of these areas anyway. If the residue bothers you, it's easy to pick out, and it was easy to clean up. Moving on to the grip, again, very much like a sword grip. This one hasn't been broken, but previous Darksword Armory grips have been a tang running through, the wood core with the tang running through it, filled with some sort of epoxy or resin to fill in any kind of gaps and make it pretty stable, then wrapped in leather, then kind of lacquered or having some sort of leather paint on it or stain, and then bound in cord while it was glued, leaving these kind of impressions of the cord. And I think that's the way this one is constructed. There's different ways of doing it, but I believe that's the way this one is done. And overall, it has a handsome look. It doesn't leave stain or residue or schmutz anywhere, and the only complaint that I would have is that there's a noticeable feeling on one side of the leather. I can feel the seam of the leather, and there's a way to do that so that you don't feel the seam and it's less apparent. Here I can feel it, and if I get a fingernail on it, I could peel it or tamper with it in some way where it would diminish. In using this, I didn't find that to be the case, and honestly there's a silver lining to it as well. If you can feel the edge of the of the leather, then you kind of know which edge you're holding on to. If one is sharper than the other, if one is blunted, then there's a way without looking at the dagger that you can kind of feel which way you're holding it, at least if you're doing it with bare hands or with a glove thin enough where you can feel this ledge between it. I'm sure there's other ways to accomplish that as well, but if there's a silver lining to feeling the ledge here, it's that it isn't noticeable, it doesn't hurt, but you can certainly feel it if you hold it in your hand. One edge has a slight ridge on it, the other does not. Apart from that, there's not really any change. It has a slight kind of profile taper, but there's not really much of a swell or taper in the other dimensions. Ever so slightly there is, but it's not bad. Overall, though, it really locks into my hand. It feels good. I have no complaints about it. And again, either place that the grip transitions to either the crossguard or the pommel, there's no residue or anything messy to show, and it doesn't overlap in a way that is unpleasant to the eye. All right, next I'm going to talk about the Crossguard, and this is giving me a deeper appreciation for pointy quillins right here. Now, a lot of swords that I've tested from Darksword Armory have had some complaints from me from the quillins being a little bit too sharp, and part of that is my own background. I study primarily Japanese swordsmanship, and if I bring the sword to my forehead, as muscle memory has taught me to do, then I will bop my noodle with one of the quillins, and there's a natural selection element to be aware of here. So this one, with a dagger, I don't do that. It's not intrinsic to the usage of a dagger for me, so I'm not bopping myself in the forehead with them, which is nice. But when I went to go throw it, I would say I had more luck getting the quillins to stick than the actual pointy part of the dagger. So with that in mind, the quillins, I can tell you, have some level of durability. I haven't used them to parry sword strikes, but they have stuck into a tree and been pulled out and still maintain their shape, so they have some level of durability. Shape-wise, though, the profile is, I think, quite handsome and imposing. It has pointy bits on either end, and it profiles and tapers out in a hexagonal kind of cross section, and it swells up and has a nice, neat center ridge here that's been buffed to a shiny overall appearance. As I mentioned, they hold up. They don't come to like a needle point, but they're pointy enough to be to stick into the bark of a tree anyway. The gap in the crossguard is where the blade meets the crossguard is a little bit wide, and I can make out some of the resin here. It's the only spot where I'm able to see any kind of epoxy residue or anything like that, and it's started to rust a little bit around the area again from neglect, but I don't see that water has really penetrated or got very deep in there because of the epoxy bits and whatnot that are in there. So having wider areas than the blade is a cosmetic thing, and historically sometimes the gaps were large and sometimes they were small, and probably more large than small, and sometimes grips or crossguards were moved to different blades, and so that basically means that this isn't ahistoric or anything like that. But I do like when the gap here has a more narrow tolerance on the blade, and this one is a little big, not grotesquely so, but it's a little wide. I can also make out some ridges in some areas where it looks like it's been made to fit the blade, and I think the resin that I see here actually dulls it up a little bit because it's also black, and it makes some of the edges jut out a little bit less. So that's one area that things theoretically could be improved, but again, for $265, I'm not really expecting the world. This isn't $1,000. I'm not expecting kind of pinpoint precision level stuff here. This is not terrible, just a potential avenue for improvement. Before I move to the blade, I'll talk about the scabbard. It very much appears to be a Darksword Armory scabbard. It looks basically and has many of the same features as their larger sword scabbards. It has kind of two risers that run through a similar retention system, though this one comes, instead of with a belt, it comes with two little loops that hook around just about any belt. And I found that more or less this retention system seems to hold the dagger vertical, and I don't find that it tips upside down and falls out. But were it to do that, it's still reasonably tight, but I can deploy it with a simple pull. The retention on it is friction fit, but not so much that it really gets stuck, though your mileage may vary depending on your humidity and dryness and all of that kind of stuff, which can affect the swelling. Also, if you get it wet or not. I didn't use it in the rain. It does have some little rain flaps here, but presumably if this got wet, it might tighten down. Things might change. In any case, I found it to have a good level of retention, and I thought that the scabbard as well and these little belt loops held the item vertically on my hip, and when I bent over to pick things up because I saw a piece of candy on the ground, the blade didn't turn upside down. Though if it did, that friction offers an additional level of security. Also comes with a matching little chape at the end here, this little bit here. Worth noting as well, if you are using this for garb or something like that, or it's more or less a dress piece, that sometimes these chapes, when they're bigger, have a little bit more of a hook here. And I am somewhat clumsy, so if I were to walk around a Ren fair and there was a tablecloth to be caught on, I'm sure my sword might catch it and I inadvertently might do the bull in a china shop kind of thing. So this one is pretty small and it doesn't feel like it's much to catch on anything, so I find that to also be a pleasant bit. All right, now I'm going to move on to the blade, the pointy stabby part. And more or less, there is a fuller that runs roughly 3/4 of the way down, transitions to a diamond cross section with the center ridge running all the way out to the tip, which gives the tip just a little bit more reinforcement, so to speak. It's pretty thick and doesn't flex much at all. It maintains, well, it has some distal taper to it. Measurements will be in the description down below, but more or less it's pretty thick and uniform all the way through. And the tip is also held up pretty well. I did some aggressive, stabby, choppy things into wooden blocks and whatnot, and tried to twist after I stabbed into wood to more or less deform the tip. And other than maybe like 0.5 millimeter or something, there's really not much. The tip is still very sharp. I wouldn't want to press on it much more than this before it's gonna poke through me. So anyway, blade profile, double-edged, and goes to a reinforced kind of diamond cross section. Not really reinforced, but the center ridge runs pretty uniformly all the way out to the tip. So the tip has at least some level of robustness to it, which I think is substantiated by the way that I treated it. The fuller is pretty evenly finished on either end, which is something I tend to be a little bit particular about. I often see that fullers terminate in different areas. They actually appear to be even here. And the center ridge doesn't wander, and the planes are actually on this very, very smooth. I'd imagine it's easier to get them smooth on a dagger than on a sword, where it wavers around a little bit, but the planes here are really quite smooth. Now this one came with a sharpening service. I would say that it is sufficiently sharp, but not as sharp as I would like a dagger to be. So I can hold it, I can kind of pinch it in my hand. Those are things I wouldn't like to necessarily do with a dagger. There's some argument to be made around a sword, but I think with a dagger, you'd probably want it to be pretty sharp. And fortunately, while there is a very minor secondary bevel on here, I think the overall edge profile is sufficient to put a really, really keen edge on. I've only tested this with the sharpening that Darksword Armory provided. That's what you get out of the box. That's what I'm judging. But you could very easily, conceivably, put a much keener, sharper edge on here if you wanted to, and it has the profile to do that, I think, with minimal work. So in a future video, maybe I will do that and try to slash through a pool noodle or something like that. As it is, it's not going to chop pool noodles and stuff much, but this is more of a pokey boy, I think, than a slashy boy. Apart from that, you have the Darksword Armory logo kind of etched in right here, or carved in. I think it's etched anyway, but it's recessed. It's not a decal or something like that, which is nicely done, and it all has kind of a mirror polish to it, which gives it a kind of a zazzy look. I think they walked the line. A lot of like mirror polish things tend to have a cheap look because so many kind of really inexpensive things came with a mirror polish, but it was a sign of wealth in the historical sense. So here I kind of like that they have some level of mirror polish. It has a level of bling and zazz to it, which I think is well accompanied by the scabbard that they have. Now, I don't know how historic this retention system is or how historic the package is, but to me, at least to my eye, it appears to be very handsome. So if you're looking for an accompanying piece to a Darksword Armory sword, or if you just want a dagger for your garb, then I think that these make overall relatively handsome packages. All right, so that's the bits and bobs and fits and features. Hopefully from there you get some idea of the build quality that Darksword Armory offers, and I'm guessing that some of that build quality is going to apply across their line of daggers. Now I'm going to talk about using it and abusing it, and more or less this dagger I think held up pretty well. I didn't do the normal stuff that I do with the sword because it's not really sharp enough to cut a pool noodle, and I'm not dicing my vegetables or buttering my bread with a dagger either. So I brought it out to do some kind of stupid stuff right away in terms of thrusting into logs and things like that. Overall, I would say it penetrated really well. It felt good in my hand. Nothing kind of jutted out and pierced my skin or made it really uncomfortable to thrust deeply into wooden material, which produces a lot of shock and throws it kind of back at your hands. So any hot spots or anything like that become very noticeable. I didn't feel any of that here, and it held up well. It's also worth noting that this dagger is the the same one that I did those tests with. Nothing is rattling or loose or really noticeable. There is the slightest of bend at the very tip. Like I said, maybe 0.5 millimeter of the tip. It's still there. It's just kind of canted off a little bit to the side. And then the pommel area has bent ever so slightly. But that came from some other abuse that I did where I threw it at a tree. Now, my aim in throwing things is pretty poor. My dad never played catch with me or something like that. But more or less, I really struggle hitting the tree with the thing I'm throwing at it. So there's a number of passes where it flies off into the woods, but I did actually hit the tree a few times. And most of the time I didn't hit with the blade side. I'd hit with the quillins or hit with the pommel. And so the pommel took a slight bend, which shows how hard I think I'm throwing it. And the quillins also penetrated into the tree a few times and stuck that way. As I noted, gave me a deeper appreciation for sharpy, pointy quillins. If I had to throw it, then having more opportunity to stick is I think appreciated here. So the pommel took a slight bend in doing this, but nothing rattling I think is quite an accomplishment here. Usually on smaller items or on larger ones too, the Crossguard starts to develop some kind of rattle. Whatever epoxy might be holding it in cracks or flexes a lot. Sometimes quillins bend, sometimes they break, and none of that happened here, apart from a very minor bend in the pommel area, which you wouldn't notice, honestly, unless I pointed it out and was kind of being particular about it. It didn't really have any issue. There are some scratches in the blade from hitting the dirt and rocks and things like that, but that's to be expected. And for hitting dirt and rocks with the tip, as well as being thrust into some relatively, hard construction material and twisted with the attempt to kind of bend the blade or what have you, or bend the tip, I'm surprised that nothing really bad happened. It held up overall really well to those things. The only complaint that I would have is that it's not particularly sharp, which I think is something Darksword Armory is working on. They sent me a new sword where their sharpening has improved from this dagger. At the same time, it could certainly be sharper. So if that's something that bothers you, then I would say you're going to have to expect to put that edge on. The flip side is I don't know anyone who really puts on a really, really keen edge, apart from maybe Landsknecht Emporium. So some of the knives or swords that I've seen from them seem to come with very, very keen edges, but most of the other folks out there don't put on like a ridiculous edge. So it's not surprising, I guess I would say, or at least it's in line with the other sword makers that also happen to make knives that I've seen. All right, so I've shown you the close-ups and you've seen how it moves and what it can do in my inexperienced hands, and hopefully that's enough to help you decide if it's worth your hard-earned money or not. But it's time for me to answer that question myself. Do I think it's worth the $265 asking price? Yes and no, but mostly yes, and I'll explain. If you are a person that already has a Darksword Armory sword, happens to be ordering one, then I think this is a good companion piece. If you want something that looks the part and is a well-made thing, I think this is worth it. And if I compare it to other well-manufactured daggers out there like Arms and Armor, if you want a dagger from them with a sheath or scabbard, then $300, $400 is not unreasonable. There are other manufacturers like Landsknecht Emporium, who I don't think makes something exactly like this, but they have made other knives, if you will, that I've gotten a chance to play with. They were in a similar ballpark. They offered a kind of a different visual appeal. They were a little bit more rustic, but maybe had some more handmadiness to them, a little bit more historical influence. But they're also relatively expensive. So this is a well-made thing, as proven by being tossed at a tree several times, right? It held up well, and if I look at other things that I would expect to hold up well, then it's in the ballpark of cost, and so I don't think it's an unreasonable price, particularly if you happen to like the look of this one, which is buffed and shiny and symmetrical and pretty and seems overall, as I mentioned, well made. Now, by contrast, if those things are not important to you, if you don't particularly like the way this one looks, you don't necessarily care about something robust, you're not planning on using it, then a cursory search on Cult of Athena will yield results for daggers that are $50 or less. So those pieces are less expensive and may look the part for you if you happen to like them. But I wasn't able to find anything in the $50 price point or, in the really cheap price point that gave me kind of strong going to hold up the same way this one did kind of vibes. So I do think that there's a price to be paid if you choose something less expensive. This one has held up well. It seems to be heat treated well. It seems to be overall well made, and I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case if you choose something significantly less expensive. There are probably other values out there. My understanding of the market for daggers is certainly less than that of swords, so if you happen to know something that looks the part like this and maybe offers as good or a better value, throw it in the commentary down below. But to me, $265 does not seem unreasonable for basically a baby sword. It's made very similarly to the swords that they make, seems to hold up in a similar capacity as well and be a pretty durable and overall well-made thing. So Those are my thoughts. Hopefully it's helpful. Thank you again to Darksword Armory for sending this sample my way. I had a lot of fun testing it. If you would like to see me push it to failure or find any value in it, please explain why in the commentary down below. I'd like to know. I'm not opposed to doing it, maybe sharpening it, revisiting it, pushing it to failure. Let me know if there's some use to be had there. Anyway, that's all I've got. Cheers, and thanks for watching.